Hello, and welcome back to Annexed, a podcast that dives into why crimes against Indigenous populations in the United States typically go unrecognized, unreported, and unresolved, with the goal of raising public awareness of what is missing in the media and the American narrative. In our second episode, we talked about two tragic cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women in the United States. The first case was that of Emily Riesling, a 33-year-old mother and tribal dancer living in the Yurok Reservation in California. Emily had been struggling with mental health issues before her disappearance from the reservation in October of 2021. Emily has still not been found, and there have been no updates on her case. The second case we discussed was that of Sophie Sergi, a 20-year-old Alaska native and University of Alaska student who was found murdered while visiting a friend in her dormitory. Despite many people being nearby at the time of Sophie's death, her case went cold for 25 years. In 2018, the Alaska State Troopers Cold Case Unit decided to test evidence left behind from the vicious sexual assault and murder, which led to their arrest and sentencing of 47-year-old Stephen Downs, who attended the University of Alaska with Sophie. Stephen is serving 75 years in prison, and the Sergi family finally found justice for the loss of their daughter. However, as I mentioned, there are thousands of missing and murdered American Indian and Alaska Native individuals who do not receive justice or even attention to their cases every year in the United States. In this episode, we will talk about ways that we as American citizens, the U.S. government, and local institutions can do to better support and protect these populations who have been silenced in our country for far too long. Thank you for listening to Annexed. American Indian and Alaska Native populations have experienced a long history of genocide, forced relocation, family separation, and exclusion in the United States, which begs the question, how can we make up for the immense damage we have caused? This question brings up the concept of reparations. Merriam-Webster defines reparations as the act of making amends, offering expiation, or giving satisfaction for a wrong or injury. In the Atlantic article titled "The Case for Reparations," author Ta-Nehisi Coates argues for reparations for Black Americans for 250 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, 60 years of separate but equal, and 35 years of racist housing policy. Coates argues that reparations are not meant to excuse slavery, but to address the economic impact and racial inequalities that African Americans have continued to experience since the founding of our nation. Coates emphasizes that the first step to reparations for Black Americans is admitting that our nation enabled and encouraged atrocities against this racial group to happen, and it has caused inequalities still present to this day. After admitting our history, Coates would like to see a federal policy passed addressing what would be done to repair the inequalities. In 1989, Representative John Coiners introduced the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act. For over 30 years, this act has never made it to the House floor. In the 2020 Democratic presidential race, 8 out of the 20 candidates said that they were in favor of at least establishing a commission to study the subject of reparations, and Senator Elizabeth Warren contacted Ta-Nehisi Coates to discuss his ideas on the concept. However, still no movement has been made. I believe Ta-Nehisi Coates' case for reparations is a compelling one, and something must be done to address the wrongs we have committed against African Americans in our country. However, I also argue that reparations need to be made to American Indian and Alaska Native populations, as they've experienced immense tragedies from our actions as well. Although nothing has yet been done in terms of reparations, there are some things that institutions and we as citizens can do to encourage the federal government into action. First, we need to support the cause of repatriation. I know it sounds confusing, but reparations and repatriations are slightly different. The definition of repatriation is the act or process of restoring or returning someone or something to the country of origin, allegiance, or citizenship. For centuries, archaeologists, educational institutions, museums, and government agencies have acquired Indian objects and even remains and have displayed them for the public. In 1990, Congress passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA. NAGPRA implemented guidelines for returning cultural objects and human remains of Indigenous origins from any collection that receives federal funding, including museums, universities, governments, and other institutions, to their rightful tribal origins. It also ensured anyone who does not respectfully return these items will face civil and criminal penalties. Since the passage of NAGPRA in 1990, institutions have begun cataloging their items and repatriated hundreds of thousands of cultural objects and tens of thousands of remains to their appropriate tribes, according to the Friends Committee on National Legislation. This law helped establish a dialogue between institutions, Indian tribes, and Native Hawaiian organizations to encourage cultural engagement and recognition and an understanding of the importance of museums for preserving the past. The case for repatriations is especially important now with the recent discovery of these 751 bodies that were discovered in Canada's Saskatchewan province. The bodies were located near a previous Catholic Indian residential school where Native American children were taken from their families and forced to learn Western practices to become assimilated into Canadian society, just as what happened here in the United States. This discovery also came shortly after the discovery of another 215 Indigenous children's remains at a different residential school in Kamloops, British Columbia. The findings were terribly sad for Indigenous communities throughout Canada, and the Canadian government has plans to exhume all of the bodies, identify the remains, and return them to their native villages for burial. NAGPRA made significant advancements in establishing relationships between Indigenous communities and American institutions. However, the law surrounding repatriation is still controversial in the protection of Native human remains. The Friends Committee on National Legislation states that there are still tens of thousands of skulls and skeletons in storage rooms of museums, as experts are still determining which tribes the remains originate from. American Indian tribal members fear that these remains will never be identified, and several tribes have bought land for the burial of these remains, yet the museums do not want to send them away. Although NAGPRA has its faults, the ICT, an independent nonprofit multimedia organization that serves Indigenous communities with news, entertainment, and opinion, shares that NAGPRA has now facilitated the return of some 1.7 million grave goods, 57,000 skeletons, and 15,000 sacred and communally owned objects to tribes and lineal descendants. NAGPRA will never repair the harm the United States has caused in the past, but has led to healing for tribal communities, collaborations between these communities and institutions, and a model for tribal consultation which should be replicated in other facets of reparation to ensure a better future lies ahead for all people in our country. Next, we will discuss more important possibilities for reparations for American Indian and Alaskan Native communities. Stay tuned. One of the biggest contributing factors to the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis in the United States is the issue of jurisdictional boundaries of tribal lands. Depending on the particular crime, offender, victim, and location, Jurisdiction may lie with federal, state, or tribal agencies. The Bureau of Justice Statistics reports that there are approximately 326 federally recognized tribal lands in the continental United States, with an estimated population of 4.6 million people, of which 23% are American Indian or Alaskan Native, thereby making the classification of who is responsible for investigating the crimes very complicated. A family friend of missing American Indian Emily Riesling and an assistant professor of sociology at the University of California, Merced, Dr. Blythe K. George, argues that a large part of the reason that many Native women's cases remain unsolved is confusion with overlapping jurisdictions. When someone is taken, it is more often a finger-pointing game of whose job it is not, rather than someone taking the lead and getting justice for the family. According to a comprehensive research report submitted to the Department of Justice titled Violence Against American Indian and Alaskan Native Women and the Criminal Justice Response, What is Known? When an act of violence occurs on tribal lands, there are several agencies who may respond, including tribal officials, Federal Bureau of Investigation officers, Bureau of Indian Affairs officers, and in PL 280 states, which include California, Alaska, Minnesota, Nebraska, Oregon, and Wisconsin, state police officers. Jurisdictional confusion is not alone in stalling investigations into missing and murdered American Indian and Alaskan Native cases. Lack of funding of tribal agencies, inadequate training, geographic barriers, limited specialized officers for sexual assault offenses, cultural conditions, and underreporting of victimization also contribute to the severe lack of data and the growing missing and murdered Indigenous people crisis. Two federal policies that are attempting to counteract the massive underreporting of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and the jurisdictional barriers of tribal lands are the Violence Against Women Act and the Tribal Law and Order Act. The Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, was passed in 1994 as part of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act to address the rising rates of violence against women in the United States. In 2005, VAWA was amended under the Violence Against Women and Department of Justice Reauthorization Act to specifically address crimes against women of vulnerable populations, such as American Indian and Alaskan Native women, which was included in Title IV of the Act. According to the Violence Against American Indian and Alaskan Native Women and the Criminal Justice Response Report, Title IV of VAWA grants tribal access to national criminal databases, creates a national tribal sex offender registry, and mandates national studies to examine violence against American Indian and Alaskan Native women, such as the 2016 Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report by the Urban Indian Health Institute, and the effectiveness of federal, state, and tribal responses to this violence. This federal policy has been significant for providing grant funding to establish American Indian and Alaskan Native victim services, enhancing law enforcement training and education, requiring courts to give full credit to enforce tribal laws, and improving the coordination between jurisdictions and tribal agencies. The second federal policy that plays a critical element in the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis is the Tribal Law and Order Act, which was established in 2010. This law enforces the Bureau of Justice Statistics to create a tribal crime data collection system and encourage tribal participation in national database systems. The law recognizes that the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Department of Justice have consistently lacked communication on crimes in tribal communities for decades. It aims to clarify the responsibilities of tribal, federal, state, and local governments in crimes against Indigenous peoples, improve coordination and communication between the government and tribes, educate tribal communities on resources available to promote safety on reservations, standardize the collection of criminal data and investigations, and reduce the prevalence of violent crime, including sexual assaults, drug trafficking, and addiction on tribal land. Although the Violence Against Women Act granted Native tribes full access to the United States National Criminal Databases in 1994, and the Tribal Law and Order Act encouraged tribal participation in national database systems in 2010, NamUs, the Department of Justice's National Missing and Unidentified Person System, which we have discussed in the previous episodes, only includes a tiny fraction of missing and murdered Indigenous people cases in their yearly counting. Remember how we shared in episode 2 how out of the 5,712 missing and murdered Indigenous women and girl cases in 2016, only 116 of them were logged into NamUs. That is only 2% of cases officially identified by the United States main database and research center specifically for these instances. So why are these database systems still not incorporating Indigenous experiences, even with federal policy saying they must? A hint is to think back to episode 1 of Annexed. American Indian and Alaskan Native populations have experienced such injustice and tragedy from the hands of the people claiming they want to support them now, so why should they trust these systems to incorporate them? The legacy of racist government policies, forced removal, land seizures, and other violence against these populations by our country have directly contributed to the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis by continuing to silence these victims. Justice Ta-Nehisi Coates argued in his case for reparations, many American Indian and Alaskan Native tribal members emphasized that the first step in reparations for their communities would be to acknowledge and teach the true history of the United States. Kanasarakan, a member of the St. Regis Mohawk Nation, whose English name is Lauren Thompson, shared with ABC News in the article titled, "To Native Americans, Reparations Can Vary from Having Sovereignty to Just Being Heard," that America owes it to its people more so than me. It owes its people the truth as it actually is. Right from the first day that we met on the shores of the ocean, all the way through to correct history, because of all the history that you're being told in the public schools, it's all lopsided. Kanasarakan argues that the United States has a responsibility to its people, especially to its younger generations, to tell the true history of colonization and creation of the American dream. To do this, we must update our educational systems by rewriting textbooks, altering our United States history curriculum, and being open and honest about the terrible roles that we as a nation has played for the benefit of white citizens to hopefully create better futures for everyone. By acknowledging our country's true history, American Indian and Alaskan Native populations might feel more comfortable sharing their experiences and working with U.S. law enforcement agencies to resolve crime. Some other potential reasons crimes against and among these communities are so underreported are because of confusion around how and who to report cases to, not being aware of the databases available to tribal communities, and lack of access to technology and other resources necessary to effectively communicate with outside institutions. For instance, the short 3-minute NPR podcast titled, "For Many Navajos, Getting Hooked Up to the Power Grid Can Be Life-Changing," discusses the issue of how a quarter of Native Americans in the United States struggle with infrastructure like the internet, electricity, and running water. Located in Dilkin, Arizona, is a Navajo reservation where 10% of its members live without electricity, and as much as 40% have to haul their water large distances and use outhouses. Utility crews are volunteering their time to install power to these Navajo families, which will enable them to pump water, charge their phones, store food, apply to jobs, and have access to other resources. It is also critical that these national crime databases work in partnership with tribal communities to educate them about how to use their systems so that we may receive more accurate statistics of violence in and among the American Indian and Alaska Native populations. For example, NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Person System, which we have talked about extensively, is currently working with tribal law enforcement agencies to close the data gaps related to missing Indigenous people. Their goal is to ensure that every tribal law enforcement agency knows about the database and leverages NamUs to help resolve cases across jurisdictional boundaries. Additionally, the Sovereign Bodies Institute, or SBI, which is funded and supported by the Open Collective Foundation, is leveraging Indigenous traditions of knowledge transfer and data gathering to conduct research on violence against Indigenous people. SBI upholds the sovereignty of Indigenous lifestyles, land, and epistemologies, and does not accept any grants from extractive industries and colonial governments. SBI was created to research the epidemic of violence plaguing American Indian and Alaska Native populations. The Institute has a project called Toki Ishi Suni Wochek. Apologies if I mispronounced that. But that means, I will see you again in a good way, that aims to understand and intervene in the large amount of trafficked, missing, and murdered Native American women and children in Northern California. The project has concluded that California is ranked the 5th highest state for the number of missing and murdered Indigenous people, and more than a third of the cases occur in the northern part of the state. Supporting the Sovereign Bodies Institute, either through donations, reporting information, or simply telling others about their work, and other organizations that are working towards gathering knowledge about crimes in Indigenous communities, is critical to gaining a more accurate understanding and foundation for addressing the missing and murdered Indigenous people crisis in our country. Next, we will talk about other ways that we as citizens and hopefully allies of these communities can better support and protect their interests. Stay tuned, and thank you for listening. First, I want to talk about the concept of tribal sovereignty, which is the authority of Indigenous tribes to govern themselves and their land in the United States. The Climate Justice Alliance highlights some ways that we can support tribal sovereignty, starting with advocating for the federal government to implement the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which would grant sovereignty and help protect Indigenous culture, spiritual practices, language, and sacred sites. I also highly recommend listeners to stay in tune and up to date with the Supreme Court hearing of Brackeen versus Holland. Forgive me if I mispronounce that as well, which is reviewing the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978 for potential reauthorization. If reauthorized, the improved Indian Child Welfare Act could help enhance sovereignty for tribal communities by protecting the interests of Indian children and promoting the stability and security of Indian families. Next, we must advocate for free, prior, informed consent to be codified into law with a right of judicial review to prevent federal authority from removing any more land and resources from these communities. The Climate Justice Alliance also promotes establishing a 12-year fund to repair government and tribal relationships and support a just transition of Indigenous tribes to affordable, sustainable homes, ecosystem restoration, renewable energy, community healthcare, and community building jobs. Right now, it is absolutely critical to leverage the power of the ballot to vote for these important human rights issues affecting Indigenous populations to attempt to provide some restitution and reparations for the communities that have been so unfairly wronged for so many years. Another crucial step to reparations is to simply listen to the stories and experiences of American Indian and Alaska Native individuals and their experiences in our country. If we do not understand the injustices we committed in the past, it will be impossible to move forward to a just future for all. Jamie Black is a Manitoba-based artist and a member of the Indigenous Métis tribe who leveraged her passion for art and her anger over the missing and murdered Indigenous people crisis to create the Red Dress Project. The Red Dress Project is an expression of her grief and connectedness to Indigenous women with the goal of drawing attention to the gendered and racialized nature of violent crimes against Aboriginal women and to evoke a presence through the marking of absence. Black displays red dresses in spaces throughout Canada and the United States to remind the public about the staggering number of Indigenous women who are no longer with us due to violence against this population. The Red Dress Project is an innovative and passionate example of how we may spread awareness of this crisis to garner public support. The Field Museum in Chicago has also created an exhibit called Native Truths, Our Voices and Our Stories, to share stories told by American Indian and Alaska Native people of self-determination, continuity, and resilience through words, music, dance, and art. The exhibition also emphasizes current issues facing Indigenous populations, such as the sovereignty and threats to tribal land, and encourages a better, more inclusive future in the United States. I highly recommend listeners to attend this exhibition if they are able to, or do anything they can to listen and share Native experiences. Spreading awareness about the missing and murdered Indigenous people crisis and giving more attention to the cases plaguing these communities in the media, social media, and in homes across the country will be the best support to encouraging the federal government, local governments, and other institutions to implementing policies to decrease and prevent this crisis moving forward. According to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, May 5th is Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples Awareness Day. The day after Thanksgiving, which has a tragic and gruesome history against Native populations itself, is dedicated as Native American Heritage Day. On these days, it is important to educate yourself, your families, and your communities about the true history of the United States and tribal populations, and listen to the experiences of these communities. I encourage listeners to question what they hear in the media and challenge themselves to listen to the voices that are often not heard or exposed. I hope this podcast has been enlightening in regard to the issues faced by American Indian and Alaska Native members and the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis, and inspiring to establish reparations and just practices moving forward. Thank you for listening to Annexed.